Can a simple curve put in check a whole weekend for Ferrari? Today we analyze why Charles Leclerc ended up against the wall in Canada and what his accident really tells us about the situation of the Italian team. It was the first session of the weekend. The teams were beginning to collect critical data for the development of the setup and the race strategy. Ferrari, aware of the importance of a solid start, sent Charles Leclerc on track with soft tires, looking for not only fast times, but also evaluating the behavior of the SF25 under light load. And it soon replied. His name appeared at the top of the timetable, a clear message for his rivals, but also a dangerous message for himself. The car seemed to be fit, the rhythm was competitive, and Leclerc felt it. Too much. Instead of giving a cooling turn or adjusting its rhythm, it kept the intensity. I wanted more. That desire for more time on track, more advantage over its competitors, more confidence within the team was what fed the error. In a category where the differences are measured in thousands and each decision can have fatal consequences for a full weekend, this type of mentality can lead you to glory or to the catastrophe. And when it reached curve 3 at that decisive moment, that need to confirm his leadership turned against him. What followed was a dramatic sequence of events that left Ferrari shattered against the wall, the neutralized session, and the paddock in silence. At that moment, everything changed. What should be a productive practice became an incident that would mark the tone of the whole weekend for Ferrari. From the wall, the engineers knew that they not only lost track time, but also faced a complex repair. From the garage, the mechanics understood that the following hours would be counter-relish. And for Charles, from cockpit, the metallic sound of the impact was followed by a direct and sincere confession by radio. He had been wrong. He did not blame the car or the track. He assumed responsibility with a should have been direct, revealing that he knew there was an escape, but chose the risk. That moment is not just the story of an accident. It is a window to the mind of a pilot who has lived seasons of glory and frustration, which seeks redemption, but sometimes pushing beyond the limit finds exactly the opposite. It is the reflection of a team that loads with its history, which dreams of returning to the top, but that remains trapped in a narrative that combines brilliance and inconsistency. In Montreal, a city that has witnessed great triumphs and historical disappointments, Charles Leclerc wrote a new chapter. And it wasn't the one he wanted. Charles Leclerc's accident in Curve 3 of the Gilles-Villeneuve circuit cannot be understood only as a human error. It is the result of a confluence of technical, dynamic, and decision-making factors and second fractions. To begin with, the curve where the incident occurred is part of a right-left high-speed chicane, which requires surgical precision both in braking and in the change of direction. The pilots arrive in that area with a strong deceleration after a relatively short line, and must at the same time manage the braking balance, the stability of the rear axle, and the weight of the car. In that context, any minimal deviation in the parameters can trigger a failure. Leclerc approached that chicane with a speeding that, under normal conditions, may have controlled. But that Friday in Montreal, the conditions were far from normal. The asphalt, even cold and covered by a thin layer of dust and loose particles, offered a minimal adhesion. This technical detail is fundamental. The lack of grip not only increases the probabilities of a blockade, but drastically reduces the margin of maneuver after that blockade. And that was exactly what happened. The car sensors recorded excessive pressure on the front brakes, which led to a total blockade of the wheels, disabled any rotation capacity at that critical moment. At that point, the Ferrari SF25 began to move without control, partially crossing the inner grass of the chicane. Here, another technical component comes into play. The grass surface, in contrast to the asphalt, further reduces the friction coefficient. Any attempt to correction about that area becomes extremely unstable. Leclerc, instead of cutting the chicane for the enabled escape, decided to try a corrective maneuver to reinstate to the path. A risky choice that, although understandable from a competitive perspective, became a tactical error of great cost. The left part of the car was the first to receive the impact against the barriers. The energy of the coup was partly absorbed by the left front suspension, which collapsed almost instantly. This structural failure generated an unbalanced inertia that redirected the car back, causing a second contact against the wall at the exit of the Curve 4. That double impact left the SF25 in a critical state, with damage to the two ends of the car. Suspension, direction, flat background, and parts of the cooling system were affected. What was a simple calculation error became a reconstruction task for the entire Ferrari technical team. But beyond the mechanical component, there is an element that amplifies the importance of this incident: the context of the accident. Leclerc had marked the best time in the session moments before, indicating that the car had real potential. That fact makes the choice of maintaining such an aggressive rhythm in an early stage of practice even more revealing. In Formula One, the risk is calculated with mathematical precision, and when a pilot leads the table, the prudent is usually consolidating the work, not looking for even more performance on a compromised track. This disconnection between the strategic situation and the runway execution speaks of a pattern that we have already seen in Leclerc. Its propensity to overcome when it feels that it has the car to make a difference. The analysis of the data after the accident confirms that, although the configuration of the car was adequate for race conditions, it was not optimized for the initial grip level. This reinforces the hypothesis that Leclerc and his team were looking to extract absolute performance too soon. In a sport where millimeters and thousandths define the difference between glory and failure, that desire to go beyond the prudent can cost expensive. And in Montreal, it cost Ferrari not only valuable track time, but also an important dose of trust at the beginning of a key weekend. The state of the asphalt in Montreal during the first measures of free practice 1 was, without exaggeration, a trap laid for anyone who dared to push beyond 90%. Although from the outside it could seem like a track in dry and visually stable conditions, the pilots faced one of the most treacherous scenarios that an urban circuit can offer. A cold surface with little rubber attached and a visible accumulation of dust and waste. This phenomenon is common in semi-urban traces such as Gilles-Villeneuve, which outside the race weekends, barely receive car activity, which means that in the first laps the level of adhesion is at its lowest point. During those initial minutes, the cars act not only as performance machines, but also as tools to clean and dominate the track. In other words, each lap launched contributes to improving the grip for the cars that come behind. But this progressive improvement implies that the first pilots to leave, such as Leclerc, also become the first to face the track in their most unpredictable state. And that has consequences. In free practice 1 of the Canada 2025 GP, those consequences were particularly severe. Several pilots, including Russell, Norris, Antonelli, Colapinto and Hamilton, experienced track trips, traction losses or even brake blocks, all symptoms of still immature asphalt. The problem was not only limited to the lack of grip. The conditions of low ambient temperature, added to the residual humidity of the previous night, caused the optimal operating window of the tires to be an extremely difficult task. Soft Pirelli, which offer great performance in ideal conditions, suffer much more when they are not in their appropriate thermal range. This translates into a loss of sudden traction, a greater possibility of skidding in the curves, and in general, a very narrow window of effective performance. For Leclerc, which chose that compound seeking to maximize its rhythm, the risk was evident. A soft tire on dirty track can behave erratically, especially in the initial braking phase, which was precisely where the failure occurred. In addition, the SF25 aerodynamic load configuration for Montreal was designed to favor peak speed in the long line of the layout. This implied that in areas of low speed and intense braking, such as curves 3 and 4, the car became more sensitive and difficult to drive. Ferrari's strategic choice, although designed for the weekend as a whole, turned against at that particular moment. It is a perfect example of how, in Formula One, a logical decision on paper can become a problem when mixed with unpredictable variables of the environment. And here comes another factor often ignored in conventional analysis: the collective psychology of the paddock during the first practices. When a pilot like Leclerc marks the best time on a track in those conditions without apparent incidents, others tend to think that you can go faster. But that also exerts pressure on the leader. Charles knew that his time was not going to last much as a reference if he did not continue pushing, especially with rivals like Russell and Norris on track. That tacit pressure, invisible but constant, led him to continue in attack mode when the most prudent had been backward, analyze the data, and wait a better time to try again. In summary, the track environment in which the Leclerc accident occurred was the worst possible to take risks. The track was in transition, the tires were not ready, the car was not in its ideal window, and the competitive context induced a false control sensation. Montreal, with its mixture of tradition and danger, again showed that in Formula One it does not always win the fastest, but the one who knows how to read the exact moment in which he must accelerate or raise his foot. Charles Leclerc's accident should not be analyzed as an isolated event or explained only for speeding in a specific curve. What happened in Montreal is, in fact, the reflection of a worrying pattern that is being manifested throughout the last seasons. The thin line that separates the ambition from imprudence, and the difficulty that even the best pilots have to identify that limit in real time. In this case, the context was clear. A dirty track, a temperature that did not favor the grip, and a first session that should be used to obtain information, not to demonstrate speed. However, what should be a simple technical installation and verification batch became a self-imposed psychological pressure exercise. Leclerc, convinced that he had the car to dominate from the first moment, wanted to send a blunt message. But the message ended up formulated, starry against the wall. In a season where every detail counts and where the fight for the championship is more open than ever between McLaren, Mercedes, Red Bull and Ferrari, this type of errors cost more than they appear. But the most disturbing is what reveals about the mental state of Leclerc. A pilot who, after several years in Ferrari, is still trapped between two versions of himself: pure talent, which can mark impossible classification times and make spectacular traces, and the pilot vulnerable to pressure, which in key moments force more than the account and compromises his own performance. In Montreal, we saw a flash of the first, but also the return of the second. And that, for a team that aspires to titles, is a duality that needs to be resolved.